you want to deepen and strengthen your relationship with God? Do you want a better understanding of the Bible? Then join us for the next few minutes as we study God's Word together on the Christ-Centered Woman's Podcast with your host, Jessica Ham. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Christ-Centered Woman's Podcast. Today we are going to be studying Genesis chapter 27 together. If you remember, last week when we left off with Genesis chapter 26, we were studying about Esau, and when he was 40 years old, he married two women who were Hittites, also part of the Canaanite tribe. And we talked about how this could have really been detrimental for his faith. And we also know that his parents, Rebekah and Isaac, were very grieved about his selection of who he married. Not only did he go against God's design for marriage of marrying one person, but he also married into the Canaanite tribe, which, as we recall, Abraham was very concerned about his own son Isaac not marrying a woman from there because they did not believe in the one true God. This is important to remember as we're going into this study because this is the background of Esau. And as we start chapter 27, we see that Isaac here has aged. His eyes, it says, are dim, and he could not see. He calls to his older son Esau, and he says, "My son." And his son Esau answers, "Here I am." As we look at this first verse, we notice that his eyes, it says, are so dim. And I want you to pay attention to this because we can parallel his physical blindness, as we're going to see in this chapter, with some spiritual blindness. We know from previous chapters that we've studied, Isaac favored Esau. And what has happened here is Esau has made some very unwise decisions, especially with his marriage. Isaac, because he favors his son, he still wants to bless his son. Even though we know back in Genesis chapter 25, verse 23, God himself made prophecy to Rebekah that her younger son would serve the older. So we have to keep in mind that this was God's plan all along. We see that Isaac wants to go ahead and bless Esau and go against God's plan. We also remember in our previous studies, Esau is the one who sold his birthright to Jacob. He didn't care enough about the blessings that he would have that he merely sold his birthright for a bowl of stew. And here we see in verse 2 that Isaac is instructing his son Esau that he wants to bestow a blessing upon him before he dies. In this particular passage, it's estimated that Isaac is about 137 years old. Genesis chapter 35, verse 28 tells us that Isaac lives until he is 180. So he did this blessing at around 137 years old. However, Isaac is aging, and so he instructs his son to go out and take his quiver and bow and go to the field and hunt game. Now, during this time, it was also very common for when someone was having a blessing bestowed upon them by their father, it usually accompanied with food or some sort of feast. So this was not an uncommon request. And so he tells his son Esau he wants him to make savory food and bring it to me that my soul may bless you before I die. However, what Esau does not know is that his wife Rebekah is listening to Isaac and Esau's conversation. Remember, Rebekah favors Jacob. And so she tells her son that she overheard Esau and Isaac having this conversation. So Rebekah devises her own plan with her son Jacob. They are going to ensure that Jacob is given the blessing. So Rebekah and Jacob devise a plan. Rebekah says that she wants Jacob to bring 2 goats and that she will make the savory food from those goats for Isaac to eat. And then she tells Jacob that he is going to take it to Isaac so that he can eat it and he will bless you before his death. A thing that's interesting here that stands out as well is, if you remember, Isaac told Esau to bring wild game, and Rebekah is substituting this for goat. And as we keep reading too, you'll notice that it's never addressed that Isaac is even able to tell the difference between wild game and then the goat that Jacob will bring him. So Jacob is concerned that Isaac is going to know that it is not Esau, because Jacob tells Rebekah that he is a hairy man and I am a smooth-skinned man. And so Jacob's concern is that Isaac is going to feel the difference in the skin. And so his mother says for him not to worry about it. And if something does happen, she says, let your curse be on me in verse 13. So basically, let me worry about that. This seems to put Jacob at ease, and so he goes through with the plan. They go and they get some clothes that were Esau's, and they put them on Jacob, so also that Jacob will smell like Esau. And then they put the skins of the goats on Jacob, and then Jacob goes and takes the food to his father Isaac. And we can see throughout this passage that Isaac seems a little hesitant to believe that this is in fact Esau, because in verse 20 he says, how is it that you have found it so quickly, my son? And he said, because the Lord your God brought it to me. And so Isaac asks to feel Jacob so that he knows that it's really Esau. And then we also see that he asks again in verse 24, are you really my son Esau? And Jacob says, I am. So we see that in verse 26, Isaac even goes so far to say, come near now and kiss me, my son. And he can smell the clothing, and he smells Esau. And he is mildly confused because we again saw in verse 22, he says, the voice is Jacob's voice, but the hands are the hands of Esau. There is some hesitation here with Isaac thinking that, is this really Esau? However, he does go ahead and delivers the blessing to Jacob. So in this blessing, we see that God gives the dew of heaven, the fatness of the earth, grain, wine. Let people serve you and nations bow down to you. Be the master over your brethren, and let your mother's sons bow down to you. Cursed be everyone who curses you, and blessed be those who bless you. And so this is the conclusion of the blessing that Isaac provides to Jacob. Of course, Isaac thinks he's supplying this blessing to Esau. So then what we see is shortly after this blessing finishes, Esau comes in from hunting. In verse 31, he says, let my father arise and eat of his son's game, that your soul may bless me. But then Isaac says in verse 32, who are you? And Esau replies, I am your son, your firstborn Esau. And in verse 33, we see where it says that Isaac trembles exceedingly. He all of a sudden realizes that he did not give this blessing to Esau. He gave this blessing to Jacob. And his trembling, so as you look through this passage, there are a few things here. It could be, and we don't know because, the Bible does not tell us here, but the trembling exceedingly. Could it be anger, or could it also be too that Isaac knows that it was God's plan that the blessing go to Jacob? And here Isaac is able to see that God's plan is going to prevail. And we see that Esau, in desperation in verse 38, is asking Isaac, have you only one blessing, my father? Bless me also, O my father. And Esau lifted up his voice and wept. And so then what we see is Isaac gives a reply, and it says, behold, your dwelling shall be the fatness of the earth, and the dew of heaven from above. By your sword you shall live, and you shall serve your brother. And it shall come to pass, when you become restless, that you shall break his yoke from your neck. What we see here is actually, so this is verses 39 and 40, what we see is the prophecy of the Edomites. Esau was the first of the Edomites. What Isaac has stated here in this prophecy is eventually what ends up happening. And it says here, you shall serve your brother, and it shall come to pass when you become restless that you shall break his yoke from your neck. What exactly is that prophesying? We know that the Edomites ended up being in constant issues and war with Israel. They did have a little bit of independence on and off. That was until the reign later of King David. And then with King David, they were under subjection. And then ultimately the Edomites just disappeared. And so that's what this is giving prophecy to here. Because of this, in verse 41, we see that it says Esau hated Jacob because of the blessing with which his father blessed him. And Esau said in his heart, "The days of mourning for my father are at hand. Then I will kill my brother Jacob." So basically, it's Esau's plan that after his father Isaac dies, he wants to kill his brother Jacob. And Rebekah overhears this in verse 42, we are told. And so she tells Jacob, and remember, she favors Jacob, so she tells him that he needs to leave and flee, in verse 43, to my brother Laban in Haran. And so she tells him to stay with him a few days until your brother's fury turns away. Well, this stay actually ends up being about 20 years. And unfortunately, what we see is that Jacob ends up leaving, and Rebekah never sees him again, because while Jacob is gone, Rebekah dies. And what we see is Rebekah was trying to protect Jacob from Esau's anger. The conclusion of this chapter is that Rebekah tells her husband Isaac, "I am weary of my life because of the daughters of Heath. If Jacob takes a wife of the daughters of Heath, like those who are the daughters of the land, what good will my life be to me?" She is concerned, basically in verse 46, as this chapter concludes, that Jacob may not find a godly wife. Here she's already got her son Esau, who is married to 2 Hittites who are part of the Canaanites. And so, of course, as a mother, she is concerned. Now, I must say, upon studying this, one of the big things I always took away was Rebekah and Jacob's deceit. But I will say, in further studying, I also feel like so much gets missed as well, because Rebekah and Jacob, yes, they were deceitful. But I will say this, their purpose was right, because we know that Esau was not the one that God chose. He also was not living in a godly way, given his marriage, given the women that he was around. So I think it is fair to conclude that Rebekah and Jacob were trying to do right. However, what we do know is that God does not support deceit. And I had mentioned Isaac's spiritual blindness earlier, and I think that's something that's important to reflect upon as well, because Isaac had so much favoritism towards Esau that he was also blinded by what God wanted and God's plan, and he wanted his son to have the blessings, who had really made some decisions that did not show favor to God. So we had Rebekah and Jacob trying to devise their own plan, which caused issues. And then we had Isaac also having his own plan with Esau, wanting to bestow a blessing. And the issue is, neither of these were what God intended. And when we try to do things that are outside of what God intends, often that is what causes us issues. Their deceit was not as bad as what could have happened, though, if Esau were left with the blessing. Because really, what it meant to be blessed during those days is that son that was blessed was then over the entire family, over the siblings, and acted as the decision maker. So we can only imagine with Esau and some of the decisions that he was making, what that could have left, not just for the family, but also for the plans that Isaac knew that God had for this family. As we conclude today's study, I want to leave us with a verse out of the New Testament that actually talks about this very study that we discussed today. And it's in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 20. It says, "By faith, Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau concerning things to come." What this tells us in this New Testament passage is that Isaac knew that the blessing was for Jacob, because that was God's plan all along. And I like to leave you with a few questions to reflect upon. The questions that I would like for you to think about today are, how could Rebekah have sought God's guidance in this situation? Because we saw in this study, there were many times where it seems Rebekah took matters into her own hands. And oftentimes that does not work out well. Also, how can we learn from the mistakes that were made by Jacob, Rebekah, and Isaac in this particular study? Thank you for listening and studying with me today. I hope that you have a blessed rest of your day. And remember, in all that you do, keep Christ-centered.